Hi everyone, welcome to AI for Mechanical Engineering. Today we're going to learn about clustering and especially about k-means clustering. Before going into the details of k-means clustering, we first need to know the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning. For supervised learning, we are building a model from labeled data. Here, this labeled data is the most important word in supervised learning. And for unsupervised learning, we are doing some machine learning from unlabeled data. And especially in today's lecture, we're going to do clustering, which is a grouping problem. So let's take a look into what label data means first. So here in supervised learning, we have these kind of data points. We can see that there are different colors for different data points. Here, this is blue, this is red, and this is green. It means that it has labels. This blue one, this means that this belongs to class 0. Red one, class C2. And this green one, class C1. So if we have our actual data points, and if we see our data points, we're going to see some data like this one. We have our X, which will be the features. And usually these features, these could be scalars or also vectors. You can imagine that these X are these each data points here. And this Y, now this is the important difference between supervised and unsupervised learning. And in supervised learning, as we learned, these Y's are the labels, which are classes in this example here. C0, C1, C2. We know the class for each data point inside our data. So based on these data, we can learn a model to do some classification problem. However, in unsupervised learning, we don't have these labels. Now, we don't have those labels. Why? There's no label. The only thing that we have are the features. X, the information of X. So you can also see in this plot here, we only have the data points. However, from this data, from this unlabeled data, what our unsupervised learning model will do is, this model will somehow learn how to divide this data or group this data into some groups like these ones, like these 3 groups. Actually, intuitively, also humans could also expect that we could group our data points into these 3 groups. And this process, there's no label inside here, and this is called clustering, and this is an unsupervised learning process. There's no label here. So for data clustering is an unsupervised learning problem, as we talked in this slide right before. However, we also need to know some given information. The given information when we're doing this data clustering, especially k-means clustering in today's class, we need to have data points or examples, which is actually very important. Without these examples, we can't do any kind of machine learning. So let's say that we have m unlabeled examples, x1, x2 to xm. So there are m data points or examples. Also, what we need to assume that is given is the number of our partitions or number of the clusters, k. We're going to suppose we know the number of the clusters or number of the groups inside our data set. And this k will be an integer. And our goal in this data clustering problem is to group the examples into k partitions. So for example, if we look into this example here, we can see that we can expect that we're going to be able to group these data points into 2 partitions, like then k equals to 2. And this is how we're going to do clustering. When we're doing data clustering, the only information clustering uses is the mutual similarity between samples. And when we're talking about these similarities, we're talking some similarity like this one. So for example, we want to have low similarity between these 2 group of our data points. However, we want to have high similarities within the cluster. So when we achieve a good clustering, it is when we have high within cluster similarity. So the data points inside one group they have high similarities, and the data points in different clusters, they have low similarities. So to do these clustering, we use k-means clustering, and let's talk about the algorithm for doing it. So k-means clustering, this is actually an iterative algorithm. And for the first step, what we need to do is we need to do initialization. The input that is given for us is, of course, we talked about this one. We have k. We need to decide which k to use, which is the number of the clusters. And of course, we have our data points. These are the features. And for initialization, we actually need to initialize the cluster centers anywhere in our feature space, Rn. So for example, if this is our training set data, what we need to do here for the first step is to initialize our cluster center. So let's say that this is center 1 and center 2 when we suppose that we are k equals to 2 in this current example. For the next step, we need to do this iteration, which is actually the first step is to do cluster assignment. What we're going to do here is for each point xi, for all of the point, we're going to calculate the distance. For example, let's say that this point, we selected this point, and what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the distance to each cluster center. So let's say that this is D1 and this is D2. And what we're going to do is we're going to find the nearest centroid and then assign the point xi to cluster k. So let's say that this is xi, some xi here, and we calculate the distance d1 and d2, which is for d1 is the distance to the first cluster, and the cluster center, let's say that's mu1, and the second cluster center, let's say that is mu2. So we calculated the distance between xi and mu1 and xi and mu2. And based on that one, we're going to be able to say that, for example, here, we can see that D2 is larger than D1. So therefore, this means that xi is closer to the first cluster center. So let's say that this xi belongs to cluster number 1, the red cluster. So yeah, actually this step here, finding the nearest centroid, this step actually means that we're computing the distance. Then after assigning the clusters for all of the data points we have, you need to calculate from here, 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 all of the data points we have. Then the next step is to, when we're once finished with the cluster assignment of all of the data points we have, the next step is to move the centroids. We're going to move the centroids, which means, let's say that this was our original mu1, and this was our original mu2. And what we're going to do is, we're going to recalculate the mean coordinate of our clusters. For example, for this red cluster, cluster 1, we know the information of these data points here. Then what we can do is we can calculate the mean coordinate of these data points. So then let's say that we calculate it, and let's say that here, this is our now mu1, the new one. So what we need to do is we need to move our centroid from the old one to the new one. Similarly, also for the blue cluster, we need to recalculate the mean point of these data samples and move this from the old one to the new one. So we're going to calculate the mean point of our data points. This could be also considered as calculating the center of mass. Simply calculating the mean point. And then what we're going to do is we're going to repeat this cluster assignment step 1 and step 2, moving the centroid step until it reaches some convergence. So one possible convergence criteria is when our cluster centers do not change anymore. Once we're done with our iterative algorithm, the output that we're going to get is C and mu. This C is the label where it contains the information of the index 1 to k, when we have k clusters of cluster centroid. So for each data point, we get this information of the index of the cluster. So we know the cluster index of any data points inside our data. This mu, this is the information of the average or mean of the points assigned to our cluster. So simply the mean of the cluster. We're going to have these two information as the output for our k-means clustering. You can know that here, this will be something like, we have two clusters. Let's say that this the data points here contains the information of the label here, C as C2, and here as C1. And here we know the coordinate of the center, mu1 equals to, let's say, x1 comma x2. Oh, here, mu2, and mu1 equals to, let's say, x1 tilde and x2 tilde. So these are the outputs that we're going to get from k-means clustering. So let's see one pictorial example of doing k-means clustering. The first step when we're doing k-means clustering is to do initialization. Let's say that we have these data points. So bunch of data points without any labels. And let's also assign k equals to 2. Like, let's assume that we're going to have 2 clusters in our data. The first step is initialization, and we're going to randomly assign our coordinates for each cluster, the blue cluster and the red cluster. And the next step is to assign the clusters. So what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the distance to each cluster. For example, this one, calculate this D1 and D2. And then if we see that D1 is closer compared to D2, then we assign the cluster label here that it belongs to the blue cluster. So we do all of these, calculating the distance for all of the data points we have, and then assign our clusters of our data points. Then the next step after doing assigning cluster is to move the centroids. So we need to recompute the cluster centers. So once we assign our cluster labels or our cluster index, then we're going to calculate the mean coordinates of these data points and then move the cluster centroid to here. Similarly, for the red cluster, we also do the same one here. So what we need to do here is we need to move our centroids. That was step 1 and 2. And what we need to do now is simply repeat this, assigning the points, which is assigning cluster, and move the clusters by recalculating the centroids until this reaches some convergence. So we can see that here, the cluster, the center of the centroid, is not changing a lot here. Then we consider this as converged learning and we stop. So now we can see that our k-means clustering have grouped our data points into 2 cluster of data points which have low similarity between different clusters and high similarities within the cluster data points. So to do one summary of k-means clustering, this was an iterative algorithm. And there were basically 3 steps. The first step is to randomly initialize our cluster centroids. If we have k clusters, we need to have k centroids. That's the random initialization step. And so this is the first step, or we can also call this as the 0 step. And then what we need to do is we need to assign our cluster. That will be step 1 that we learned in the previous slides. And here we need to move our centroids by recalculating the mean points. So this is for moving our centroid, and this was step 2 that we learned in the previous slide. And we're going to repeat 1 and 2 until we have some converged centroids of the clusters. So actually, we can think this as an expectation maximization algorithm, an EM algorithm. So for E, this means expect, and what we're doing here is expect cluster index, and what we're maximizing here is maximize the similarity, or we can say that we're minimizing the distance. So actually here, however, we have some dilemma, like a chicken and egg problem. So the first question that we can ask is, if we knew the cluster indices, CIs, how would we determine which points to associate with each cluster center? And the answer for this one is, for each point xi, we just simply choose the closest cluster index. And however, we can also ask this question. If we knew the cluster memberships, CI, how do we get the centers? To choose CI, we can choose our centers of our cluster to be the mean of all points in the cluster. So actually, to know this center information, or I'll call this as centroid, we first need to know the cluster index. That's how we can calculate this centroid. However, in the opposite, to know the cluster index, we actually need to know the centroid, because we are assigning our data cluster centroids based on the distance to the centroids of each cluster. So this is something like a chicken and egg problem. We don't know if chicken is first or egg is first, and it's something similar also here. We don't know if calculating centroid is the first or calculating the cluster index is the first. So actually, this EM algorithm, if we see our k-means clustering with the point of view of this EM algorithm, this is not perfect. But however, by repeating these maximization of the similarities, or the minimizations of the distance, but we make improvement of our k-means clustering. So that's how we do k-means clustering. Even though it's not perfect, we first assign our cluster index and then calculate our centroid and do it again and again until it converges to some good clustering or grouping that we can visually see. So that's the important part in k-means clustering. We are doing an iterative algorithm. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do one Python example together for doing this, for practicing k-means clustering. I'm going to give you an overview of what we're going to do and then do a demonstration using Colab. So firstly, what we're going to do is we're going to generate data that looks like this one. And we can actually do this using NumPy random multivariate normal function. And then what we're going to do is we're going to initialize our centroids. For example, here, here, and here, which was actually our step 0 for k-means clustering. And for doing those random initialization, we can just simply use also NumPy random function. And then we're going to do this iterative algorithm of assigning our cluster indices and moving our centroids again and again until it reaches convergence. So we have some for loop here, and we calculate some distance here, d0, d1, d2. So here, this is an example when we have three clusters. We're calculating the distance, and we're selecting the cluster index where we have the minimum distance here. So that was actually step 1, assigning our cluster. And then what we're going to do is we're going to calculate our centroid, our new centroid based on these clusters indices which were assigned right before. And we're going to repeat this again and again until we reach some good convergence, which is actually written here as error here. So if we look into the error meaning here, we can see that this is pre-mu, So the centroid coordinate in the previous iteration and the centroid coordinate in the current iteration. So we're calculating how much this centroid has changed. And if this is small enough, then we say that this is converged and stop our iterations. And also what we're going to do is we're going to do this k-means clustering in scikit-learn. So in the previous slides, we did our k-means clustering from scratch. However, we can also do this very simply using our scikit-learn library. So the only thing that you need to do is actually import k-means clustering from scikit-learn and then do k-means clustering as this one. K-means, we assign the number of the clusters and we fit it with our data points x. Okay, so now let's move on to Colab so I can do some demonstration. So let's do one demonstration of k-means clustering using Python and Colab. These Python files are all open, so please try to study and practice the codes inside this Python notebook file, and then I think it will be a great practice for you to understand better about k-means clustering. So when we're running Python code, of course, I think everyone will know this, we need to import our libraries. And here, we're going to first write the code for k-means clustering from scratch. And therefore, we're going to just use NumPy and matplotlib. So just run this, then the libraries are going to be loaded. And then what we're going to do is we're going to generate our data points. For example, we're going to generate data points like these blue dots here. And we can do this data generation using the code above here. So here we're going to generate 3 different groups of data, G0, G1, G2, with different norms, with different statistics. And then we're going to stack these data points into a matrix X. And what we're going to do is we're going to do k-means clustering on our data point X here. So the next code here, the next block here, this is the code that actually initialize the centroids of our k-means clustering. So here, we're going to first define the number of clusters that we're going to use, and I'm going to define this as 3, k equals to 3. And then I'm going to plot, then I'm going to randomly initialize these 3 data points here. Mu equals to x, random integer 0 m k. K is the number of clusters. That means we have 3 centroids, randomly initialized centroids. And if we plot this, you're going to see this as these red dots here. So we successfully initialize our centroids with random coordinates like these points here. Then the next one is actually doing the iterative algorithm for finding our k-means clustering. So here you can see that we're doing some iteration, number of iteration in range 500. So we're going to do 500, set it as the maximum iteration as 500, and do the steps that are included in doing k-means clustering. And if you remember the first step was to assign the cluster indices. And we can do this by calculating the similarities or calculating the distance from each data point to each cluster centroids. And those distances are calculated here, D0, D1, and D2. And then we select the minimum distance as the cluster index. So we assign our cluster indices from here. Then what we do is we move our centroid, the mean coordinate of the cluster, by these 2 lines here, which means that we just simply need to calculate the mean of our data points that are assigned to some specific cluster. And numpy.mean x, where some cluster y equals to I and x is 0. This will calculate the new centroid coordinates. Then what we need to do is we also need to determine when to stop this iteration. It's inefficient for doing this iteration until it reaches the maximum number of iteration. We can do this by calculating how much our centroid has moved compared to the previous one. So here, previous mu, this is the previous centroid, and mu, this is the newly updated centroid. So we're going to calculate the difference between these two inside one value here as error. And what we're going to do is, if we're going to stop, we're going to break our k-means clustering algorithm if the error or the changes of the centroid is very small. Then it will mean that our k-means clustering is converged. And if you run this, you're going to see iteration as 4. And then next, let's also visualize our k-means clustering results. So here, this is the visualization of our first, second, and third clusters, C0, C1, and C2. And you can see that the clustering was quite successfully well done because these actually matches pretty well with our intuition. Also, so what we have done right before was doing k-means clustering from scratch. We only used NumPy libraries to do k-means clustering and matplotlib library for visualizing our clustering results. So this is how we can do k-means clustering from scratch. However, we can also do k-means clustering very easily if we use libraries that was provided by others. For example, we can use the library provided by scikit-learn. So what we need to do is we need to import k-means from scikit-learn library. And then k-means clustering can be done with 2 lines. If you just simply write these 2 lines, the first line, just loading this k-means function with number of clusters of 3, and then fit this k-means algorithm using our data x. Then k-means clustering is all done. And then you can also visualize a very similar results like this one. Cluster 1, cluster actually C2, C0, and C1. So actually, these clustering, even though the colors are a little bit different, the clustering results itself are very similar. So you can use k-means clustering from scikit-learn in practice because this is very convenient. And what you can also know here is the clustering results could be slightly different when you use scikit-learn and from scratch. For example, these 3 data points here, red points, these are red points here. And however, there are 2 red points and 1 blue points here, which means that the clustering was slightly different. And these difference actually comes from the initialization of our random centroids. And we're going to talk more about the details of why these happens by explaining these in the PowerPoint slides. So as I told you before, k-means clustering have some initialization issue. And this is because k-means clustering is extremely sensitive to cluster center initialization. So as I told you before, k-means clustering have some initialization issue. And this is because k-means clustering is extremely sensitive to cluster center initialization. So depending on the initialization you do, then you may get some different results. And these bad initialization can lead to poor convergence speed or bad overall clustering, that what we don't really want to have. So actually the important thing to overcome these initialization issues is to try multiple initializations and choose the best results. In practice, this will help you a lot for doing or achieving good k-means clustering results. And the next one that I would like to talk about is, then firstly, we learned that we need to predefine the number of clusters when we're doing k-means clustering. However, the question is then, how can we know the right number of the clusters that is needed for obtaining a good k-means clustering result? So let's talk about more about this choosing the number of clusters. So the idea of getting some good number of cluster is when we're adding another cluster, one more cluster, and if this does not give much better modeling of the data, then it means that we don't need that number of clusters. So one way to select k, the number of clusters, in the k-means algorithm is to try different values of k, of course. You can try k equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And then plot the k-means objective versus k. So plot the distance that you obtain from k, and then look at the elbow point in the plot. Let's see what this really means from this slide here. So let's see what means choosing the elbow points, looking at the elbow points in the plot of the number of clusters. So for example, we can make some empty lists of cost and do k-means clustering for different values. For example, from 1 to 10 clusters. Then we're going to do k-means clustering using scikit-learn's library. Number of cluster will be each number here. And then if we fit this one, and then if we save the k-means scores, which is actually simply the distance information, then we're going to be able to plot some plot like this one. Here, this is k equals to 1, 2 to 10, and this will be the cost. And we can see that the cost significantly decreases when k equals to 1 increases to k equals to 2. And it also quite significantly decreases from k equals to 2 to k equals to 3. However, this improvement or the slope gets smaller after 3. And then we say that this number 3, this is our elbow point, like our elbow. And we can determine that the adequate number of the clusters that is needed for the k-means clustering in the current data would be k equals to 3. This is how we can determine the number of clustering that we need for k-means clustering. Let's also learn about the limitations of k-means clustering. The limitations of k-means clustering mostly comes from the fact that it makes hard assignment of points to clusters, where hard assignment means that we are using some binary indicators. It's yes or no, or true or false, 1 or 0. So it means a point either completely belongs to a cluster or not belongs at all. That's how we are doing k-means clustering. So therefore, there's no notion of a soft assignment, something like a probability of being assigned to each cluster. So in these, based on these facts of that k-means clustering is using hard assignments, we can overcome these limitations by using Gaussian mixture model or fuzzy k-means clustering because these allow soft assignments. Also, one limitations of k-means clustering is that these are sensitive to outlier examples. And to overcome these problems, we can use k-medians clustering, not k-means, k-medians algorithm. And this could provide a more robust clustering results when we have data with outliers. Also, k-means clustering works well only for round shape. And if the clusters have roughly equal sizes or density. And it also do really bad clustering if the cluster have non-convex shapes. And I'm not going to explain this in more detail, but we can use spectral clustering or kernelized k-means clustering for overcoming this problem. And let's also look into some examples, some pictorial examples of these limitations here about non-convex and non-round shaped clusters. So when we are looking to some data points like this one, we can imagine human can intuitively know that we're going to have clusters like this one. However, when we are doing k-means clustering, this algorithm will say that we're going to have one cluster here and one cluster here. And this is because k-means is based on Euclidean distance. So therefore, it has less information when we have a non-convex shape. So what we actually need to provide in this clustering is connectivity. And then, these networks or spectral partitioning could help us doing clustering when we have non-convex shapes. Also, as I introduced before, if our clusters have different densities, k-means clustering will not work well. For example, if we have some examples like this one, we can know that we will have about like k equals to 3 clusters. This is something ideal. This is what human can do. We can group our data points into 3 clusters like this one. However, if we use k-means clustering, this will cluster it something like this one, because the clusters have different densities, and this is because when we're doing our optimization problem, we're actually minimizing this cost function, which is the sum of the distance to cluster square. And we need to add this for all of the number of data. So therefore, to minimize J, our k-means clustering decides to locate our centroids in some locations that really don't do the clustering well. So that's all for today's class, and I'm going to see you in the next class about dimension reduction. Thank you very much.